Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you that will help you understand your struggle with food so you can break free from binge eating. Today is all about guilt, and guilt is a huge part of binge eating. And we have to address guilt if we want to stop binge eating, if we want to recover from binge eating, and if we want to find peace around food. It's also one of those emotions that many people describe as being one of the biggest triggers for binge eating. So a lot of people will talk about they were doing okay until they felt guilty about something they ate and then suddenly hit with an urge to eat everything. And when we think about what guilt is, it's often thought of as an emotion that we experience, an uncomfortable emotion that we experience, that is to do with having done something wrong. So it can be quite frustrating, and I've had a few messages from people that saying I'm still struggling with food guilt. I'm trying to do intuitive eating, I'm trying to find peace with food, trying to allow myself and reassure myself that it's okay to eat certain things, but I'm still feeling guilty. And it makes food very stressful and a very anxious thing. So I think there's a really important nuance to what guilt is and when we experience it. And we experience guilt when we don't live up to our own expectations. So it's more than just doing something wrong. So you might have a binge and there might be part of you that reasonably knows, okay, you didn't go out and kill anyone, you didn't harm anybody else, maybe yourself a little bit, but the feelings of guilt feel disproportionate to what is, in effect, eating what you deem to be a lot of food. The guilt comes from the fact that you believe you have not met this expectation you've set for yourself. So perfectionism and guilt always go hand in hand. What are your expectations at? So is it that you watch a video or you read a book and then you get really excited about this information you find and you say, oh, now I know this information, I'll never binge again. Now that I've found intuitive eating, I'll never binge again. And then so you've set yourself this expectation that whatever this new information you have is going to be the answer. And I can remember doing this all the time. The amount of times I thought I'd found the answer, and then when I binged again, how much worse I felt because my expectation of myself, having read this book or listened to this podcast, the expectation of myself had gone up here and it wasn't realistic. It's also why you could feel bad about doing something and everyone else is trying to reassure you that it's fine, it's not a big deal. And that doesn't reassure you. And the reason why it doesn't reassure you is because of your own expectations of yourself. So when we think about guilt and how intensely you experience guilt, I would say that might be the first place to start, is to investigate your own expectations and are they realistic? And consider consciously trying to bring them down a notch. And I know that's easier said than done, and that might even be a daily intention. Because so often, especially after a binge, you're left feeling guilty, you believe you've done something wrong, but really you've just not lived up to your own expectations. So you think you've done something wrong and you need to make it right. So then that's where the compensatory behaviours come in. That's where people will say to themselves, okay, well I binged today, so I will make up for it tomorrow. This atonement, guilt kind of tries to push us into this place I was bad, so now I need to be really good to bring myself back up. And that's what gets people stuck in the cycle again. They don't even realise it's a restrictive cycle because they're not saying to themselves, I'm going to restrict my food. They're probably not using that word. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But there will be something in what you're going to do the next day to make up for what you've done today that perpetuates the cycle. And guilt can feel like an automatic feeling. So it feels like you haven't even had a thought about your expectations or anything like that. It could be you just eat food or certain kinds of food or a certain amount of food, and as soon as you feel that you've eaten that food or you realise you've eaten that food, this uncomfortable feeling rushes in. And this uncomfortable feeling you're calling guilt. And it might be guilt, especially if you eat and you feel full, and if you have a meal and you feel quite full, Sometimes just that physical feeling of fullness is so close to that physical feeling you get when you binge, even though it might not have been a binge. So guilt can start to creep in around food, even when you're not binging. Because your expectation is, and the expectation of diet culture, is that you should never be too full. If you are too full, you've eaten too much, and you should not eat too much. Whatever it is, you will have that belief. I imagine most of you, if you struggle with binge eating, there is a belief in there that says, I shouldn't eat too much. Even if you're doing the intuitive eating, there's part of you going, okay, but if I'm eating intuitively, that means I shouldn't be eating too much. But that's what eating is. Like, sometimes we eat too much and sometimes we're hungry. Like, it's this constant, like, self-correcting, and I'm reluctant to use the word self-correcting, but this idea, the expectation is that you're going to have this perfect style of eating where everything feels comfortable and you always eat the right amount and you're listening to your body perfectly and you're always in tune with what you want. And so this expectation starts to get built up even around something like intuitive eating. And so then when you don't eat like that, you feel like you haven't lived up to your own expectations. That's where the guilt comes from. The guilt is always about like your values, feeling like you've breached your own values, but we need to really look at our values and see whether they're serving us. So let's say you've binged, or you've eaten something that you didn't want to, or part of you saying that you shouldn't have, and the guilt rushes in. So you're feeling guilty and you're feeling anxious around food. And the urge to somehow compensate for that by a plan or whatever it might be is present. I suppose there's something about finding perspective. Because when we have a feeling, especially a strong feeling, we tend to believe it. So if you are feeling really angry with someone, you're probably going to find other things to feel angry about. So if you're feeling really guilty about your eating, in that moment when you're feeling guilt, what happens to a lot of people is they start finding other things to feel guilty about, other places in their lives where they feel like they haven't met their own expectations. I'm not a good enough daughter, I'm not a good enough partner, I'm not a good enough parent. All those things, all those times when you haven't met your own expectations come rushing in. So now you've compounded this feeling. So you've got layers of guilt going on. It's getting bigger and bigger. It's quite hard to get yourself out of that. So the intention when you feel guilt, I suppose I would urge you to number one, ask what your expectations are. Really clearly define what the expectation is that you feel like you've breached. And then the next part is to find perspective. Because whatever we're feeling, we're in it, we're believing it, we're experiencing it, everything else is kind of crowded out. So all the good in your life, all the good things that you do, all the things that hold a lot of value for you that aren't around food, that are important and give a sense of purpose in your life, none of that matters in the moment. But an intention to the next time that you feel guilty, to look for perspective. And I don't mean, got to be careful here, because then what can happen with some people is like, well, I'm feeling guilty and I was trying to work on my guilt, so I shouldn't be feeling guilty. I've breached my expectation that I was going to handle my guilt much better than this, and then you can feel guilty about feeling guilty. So there's all these layers of guilt. But also, this idea of feeling guilty about something is about the past. It's normally about what's happened in the near past or in much further back. And so that whatever's happened is completely beyond your control. Whether you've just binged is not in your, there's nothing you can do about it now. It's not in your control. So to feel guilty about it, like the question is, how productive is that? It doesn't mean it doesn't come, but we're just investigating and playing with guilt here. It's like feeling guilty about the weather. You'll say, but I was the one who binged and I shouldn't have done that and I'm trying to do something different. So of course, I know that I couldn't control the weather, but I could have controlled or done something different with my eating. But the thing is that you didn't. And so what guilt does is it leads you to feeling even worse now, which, as I mentioned at the start, guilt is a huge trigger for a lot of people. So the chances are, if you're feeling a lot of guilt, you are setting yourself up potentially for more binging. which is not what you want at all. And people worry about, well, if I don't feel guilty about binging, that means I'll do it even more. But when it comes to taking responsibility, the only time we can take responsibility is in the here and now. You can't even take responsibility for what you're going to eat tomorrow yet. That's tomorrow. All you can take responsibility is like, what am I doing now? What next? So I'm noticing that guilt has come because of what I've eaten. Can't control the emotion, it comes. You've investigated it. You've tried to shift perspective. And now it's like you choose your response. Responsibility, the ability to respond, you choose your response. Previously, your response is often, I would imagine, I'm going to make up for it. But I wonder what response would serve you more. So the response being like, what am I going to focus on tomorrow? Rather than what am I going to do tomorrow? It's that focus on behaviour rather than where you want to put your attention. Because when you try and restrict your behaviour, you're going to get other thoughts and emotions that are going to be triggered off. But when it's like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to pay attention to how I feel, or I'm going to set an intention to try and really appreciate my food, because at the moment I'm feeling disgusted by food. So really, to rebalance the scale, to come to that sense of appreciation, I'm going to prioritise satisfaction. I'm going to prioritise presence, whatever it is, to kind of get yourself a bit of balance that's not going to swing you the other way. So these are just a few things, a few ways of thinking about guilt. I know that it's a feeling that's common for a lot of people, and if you're someone who feels guilty about food, chances are you're feeling guilty about a lot of other things in your life, and chances are it boils down to your expectations. So that's where I would urge you to start if you want to start feeling less guilty. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, and I'll see you on the next video.